Okay, welcome back to Pacific Legends Unleashed. You going to join in
I
me?
don't want to make it predictable.
Oh, okay.
We don't want to be naff.
On to our second big legend.
Yep.
Well, we've got a couple of legends this time, as you probably saw us in the title. Scott and Amundsen.
Yep. Two absolute weapons who had something to do with the Pacific sometimes.
And it's all about their race to the pole. And you may have heard the story before, you may have heard some of the details, but you've probably never heard it unleashed.
No.
We're going to be taking it off the leash, aren't we?
Absolutely. That's what we do.
Yeah, so let me just set the scene. The year is 1900. It's kind of like 100 years from Bly's lifetime, from our last kind of character, right?
Yep.
And I guess what has changed? Most of the world's been explored, right?
Yep.
Except for a couple of places. North Pole,
Mm-hmm.
unconquered. South Pole, unconquered.
Yep.
These were the last frontiers of exploration. So the world was waiting for some kind of heroic explorer to conquer them. And that's where my mate Robert Falcon Scott and Amundsen come in. The other things that have changed, the technology of boats has come a long way since Bly's day. No longer do they rely purely on the wind and sails,
Mm-hmm.
because there's been the development of steam-powered propellers. Obviously, you just have to load that boat full of coal and you can go any which way. You don't have to worry about wind direction. You don't worry about getting stuck in the doldrums.
How good.
You can go more places, which has opened up a whole lot of new areas to explore.
Imagine if Bly's crew had that when they were trying to get around the Cape.
Oh, yeah.
Just power through
Yeah,
rather
they
than
would've
being
just
blown backwards.
charged around there.
Yeah.
But ironically, the British still haven't been able to find the Northwest Passage. Not from lack of trying, though. You know, there's Cook, there's Bly, and then after that came Franklin,
Yep.
real famous expedition. He gave it a good crack in 1845, took 2 boats and 129 crew, and they got stuck in there for 2 years.
Goodness me.
Eventually, all of them died, mostly from like lead poisoning
Rest in peace.
and losing their minds.
Why were they eating lead?
Well, there was nothing else to eat, mainly because of the tins, the cans that they had all their food in.
Yeah, okay.
What's interesting about that is Franklin died an absolute hero. You know, the British public loved the story of it. Like, he went down in history, and maybe that was an inspiration for Scott in the future.
Yeah, they finally cracked it, the Northwest Passage.
Interesting thing about that one though is that the boats that they used in 1845, they weren't found until 2014,
Wow.
and that's when kind of the mystery was finally solved of how far they got through,
Yeah.
etc., etc. So the romantic idea of British exploration was alive and well at the turn of the century. And polar exploration, that was the new big thing. I'm going to pass it over to you and you can lay us down some facts.
Yeah. We opened our last series about William Bligh by discussing one of the many significant voyages of Captain James Cook.
Yes.
In fact, his last voyage, because he was, remember, unceremoniously dispatched by the indigenous peoples of Hawaii.
That was a bit sad.
He'd never make it back to England again. Yeah, rest in peace, Cook.
It was cooked.
And I can't think of a better way to start a brand new series than by talking about the same thing we spoke about in the last one.
Didn't we just do 4 episodes on that?
So let's cast our minds back, though. I do want to stick with Cook for a moment, to Cook's first voyage from 1768 to 71
Yes.
aboard the Endeavour.
Oh.
And that was when Cook first visited Tahiti. He sailed in like a god with his white sails billowing.
Like a god.
What a legend. And he'd been commissioned by King George III to observe the transit of Venus across the sun. They were trying to figure out how far away the Earth was from the sun.
Mm-hmm.
And he was supposed to do this. That was definitely one of his tasks. But he was also given secret orders.
Oh.
Top secret, only to be opened once transit of Venus had occurred.
Okay.
And his first mission was sort of accomplished. So Cook, trembling hands, opened the envelope.
Did they have a password or something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love Joseph Banks was the password.
How many capital letters?
And his king and country, he realised upon opening this envelope, required him to undertake a perilous journey south.
Sounds like The Hobbit.
Yeah, he needed to destroy the ring. And he was accompanied on that trip by a short little hairless...
Smeagol.
No,
William Bly.
he was just... He
Okay.
was very Smeagol-like. Bly. He was supposed to go further south than any European man, woman, vessel had gone before to find the great undiscovered southern
Continent.
land. Yeah, the final continent. Now, Antarctic is a big, fat piece of ice.
Mm-hmm.
It's so big and fat. It's the world's 5th largest continent. It covers about 14.2 million square kilometres.
Fat shaming.
Sorry, that wasn't meant to be a personal attack. So it's about twice the size of Australia. It's about 140% as big as Europe.
Yes.
And I know we've got a big Irish fan base.
Yeah.
It's blowing up there. And so to give a bit of a shout out to them, Antarctic's about 166 islands.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. Which actually makes it sound kind of small.
Does it?
I don't know. Ireland's
160.
tiny.
166.
Insignificant place.
Excuse me? We're great at rugby.
Anyway, 98% roughly of this 14.2 million square kilometres is made up of the Antarctic ice sheet.
Mm.
And that is about 2,000 metres thick, which is crazy to me. And to give you some sense of scale, because when you're talking about measurements like that, sometimes it's hard to really figure out what that means. That's about 1,300 tiny little William Blythes standing on top of each other.
I'm glad you did the maths on that.
Yeah.
It's good.
It's
good facts.
Yeah, we do what we need to for our listeners.
That's taking it off the leash, man.
Yeah. So that 2 kilometre thick sheet holds about 61% of the Earth's fresh water. If it was to melt, we'd see global sea level rises of about 60 metres.
Dunedin would be underwater.
Yeah, which would be an absolute travesty.
South Dunedin at least.
South Dunedin's underwater anyway.
Okay, yeah, true.
Really, the point that I want to make is that Antarctica is a big fat piece of ice.
I think you've made that point.
Okay. Anyway, we know that. We take it for granted. While I was conducting research for these episodes, I was consistently struck by satellite photos of Antarctica. You know, you can just see everything. It's right there. It's just on the Wikipedia page.
Mm.
The modern world maps that we see too, we've got every single inch of coastline mapped. But if you go back, you don't need to go back very far, say about 1900, you see a very different map of the world.
Yes.
And in 1900, the global population was about 1.6 billion people. So it wasn't small. None of them even knew what was down there, beyond the coast of South America and Australia. Completely unknown.
The Kraken.
Yeah, possibly. And on maps, you look and there are those little diagrams of monsters and sea beasts and stuff. Yeah, because it was still sort of fueled by fantasy. And yeah. So 1900, 1.6 billion people. And 1900, like I said, it's recent. That's 42 years after Queen Victoria sent a telegram across the Atlantic. Mm-hmm. Technology pretty good. 18 years after the first Ashes Test match.
Relevant.
Yeah, it's so relevant that I want to dwell on it for a little minute. So quick cricket chat.
Yes.
1882, Australia beat England at the Oval in London.
Okay.
One British paper dramatically declares that England cricket's died and that its body will be cremated and the ashes taken back to Australia. Before they embark on that tour, though, the English captain vows to regain the Ashes.
Yes.
And England would go on to win 2 of the 3 tests they played in Aussie. And they were then, in turn, presented with a little wooden urn, which apparently had the ashes of a wooden bale that had been burnt. And that was supposed to represent the ashes of Australian cricket. A great rivalry was born. Are you aware of who the England captain was on that tour?
Michael Vaughan.
No, he was...
Before that?
Before that.
In Botham.
Ivo Bly.
Oh, here we go.
And as far as I can tell, don't quote me on this or anything that I say on the show, Ivo Bly was the great-great-nephew of one of history's starchiest men.
Did the team mutiny against him?
No, it doesn't seem that way. No, I think they'd gotten over that. He didn't have that quirk of encouraging mutinies everywhere he went.
He flogged anyone if they bowled a wide.
Yeah, there we go. Captain Bly, he's got his finger in this pie as well. Anyway, to get back to my main point, because I know our listeners are not a patient bunch of people, in 1900, yes. Adolf Hitler was 11.
Yes. Relevant.
Well, it's the modern world, right? Yes.
Okay, yeah.
So, The Wizard of Oz had been published. We'd got a bunch of vaccines and everything, but we still don't even know what the bottom of the planet looks like.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Wild to me. And I say that that's wild.
Had Invercargill been settled?
No, I don't think anyone lives there now, do they?
Is that what you're talking about, the bottom of the world? No one has been to Invercargill.
No, I mean geographical bottom, not like bottom as in worst. And so I say that that's wild, but not really knowing anything about the tips of the Earth, either of the polars, has been the norm for pretty much ever. Like the Greeks, including Aristotle, they kept banging on about this great unknown southern land, which was based on concepts related to sort of natural balance. They felt that the geography of the Earth had to be balanced. That well-known northern landmass, which was massive, had to be balanced by something in the south.
Yeah.
And Aristotle and others, they actually used the term Arcticos to refer to the Arctic, so in the north. And the word Arcticos means near the bear, which is a reference to Ursa Minor. It's a northern constellation which kind of vaguely resembles a bear. And that has Polaris, the North Pole star. And by extension, that term Arcticos, if you chuck an ant on front of that, you get opposite the bear, Antarcticos.
Oh, huge.
And there we go. So that's where the modern term comes from, at least.
Okay.
So through the Renaissance and, the development of modern Europe, the Europeans just sort of ran with that Greek logic, and Antarcticos was just drawn into charts and maps. But people were just freestyling. It was based on imagination and just whatever they wanted to be there.
But there was always this idea that there's a big southern continent.
Yeah, something there. And that idea just fueled essentially the great age of discovery. And that was between the 15th and 17th centuries. You had a bunch of people just sailing out. And the people that had for a long time guessed and fantasized about this great southern land, they started to then catalogue some pretty compelling empirical evidence. So 1520, we have Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan.
Mm-hmm.
He's cruising around South America. He was on a mission for the Spanish king, and he got down to 53 degrees south. And one crew member on that trip who survived the journey through what was eventually to become known as the Strait of Magellan said that they had been surrounded by very great and high mountains covered with snow.
Yeah.
So on both sides they could see that. And we know now that they were looking at Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego, but...
Idiots, yeah.
I mean, if only we'd been there.
Well, they thought that was the bottom of South America where they went through, right?
Yeah, they didn't know that archipelago was still...
They didn't realise there was a Drake Passage.
Yeah.
Because Drake hadn't been around there.
No, speaking of Drake, though, because he did follow in Magellan's footsteps.
Yeah.
He went through the Strait of Magellan, and then there was this crazy wind that blew them down and around Tierra del Fuego. And they kept then expecting to run into like that land that Magellan thought he'd found, but they didn't. It was just ocean forever.
Yeah.
And
he wrote that in his journal, didn't he? It was said like, started from the bottom, now we're here.
I think so. Drake.
Started from the bottom, now the whole crew's here.
That's good stuff. Was that a joke you'd prepped?
No, just straight from the top of the dome.
Yeah, right. Freestyler.
Yeah.
So I guess that's a bit of a setback because Drake didn't find anything there, but that didn't really quell that crazy sense of optimism.
Yeah.
And each new sort of rocky outcropping that people would come across was then sort of seized upon, and people started to add it to maps, and they were going, well, so they sort of had this unconnected dot to dot of what maybe was the coastline of this great unknown southern land.
Mm-hmm.
So 1642, Abel Tasman contributed to that. He was probably, almost definitely, the first European to see New Zealand.
New Zealand.
And
he thought that was the big dog.
Well, part of it maybe. They just didn't really know because he didn't go to the East Coast. He just saw the West Coast.
Yeah.
And...
What do you see, Greymouth?
Yeah, and he's
there
like...
it is.
Yeah, there's nothing more that could top that. We've peaked.
Yeah.
And then nearly 100 years later after Tasman, in 1739, a French captain with a sweet name, as they all did, Jean-François Charles Bouvier de Lozier.
Well, nice.
Yeah, the French are going to love that.
Yeah.
He sailed a really long way south and sighted a land wreathed in mist. And he wrote one of the earliest modern accounts of this Antarctic scene. He said that there were icebergs... Can I do a French accent?
Sure.
Hang on, I gotta get the character up.
Oui,
oui.
Baguette.
200 or 300, is that, feet high. Up to 10 miles long. I did French for 3 years in high school, which you can probably tell. With all sorts of shapes, islands, fortresses, battlements like floating reefs and penguins, amphibious animals like, I've gone British,
Soup du jour.
like huge ducks but with flippers instead of wings. So he's painted a very clear picture there. And so this sporadic and often, honestly, contradictory information kept sort of filtering into Europe over the next century and a bit, until the 18th century when European excitement would once again just spike. 1769, your mate, Alexander Dalrymple.
Oh, big fan.
Yeah. He worked as an examiner of sea journals for the English East India Company.
Oh, imagine how dry that would be.
I know, that is a rough job. But in his line of work, he felt like he'd come across enough of the pieces of the puzzle to sort of put them all together. And based on the key geographical features like Tasman's work and all the explorers, he sort of connected all of those dotted lines just in his head.
Yes.
He imagined what was probably there and wrote this. The number of inhabitants in the southern continent is probably more than 50 million, considering the extent from the eastern part discovered by Juan Fernandez to the western coast seen by Tasman. This is a greater extent than the whole civilized part of Asia, from Turkey to the eastern extremity of China. There is at present no trade from Europe thither, great word, though the scraps from this table would be sufficient to maintain the power, dominion, and sovereignty of Britain. So Britain bloody banging their drum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, Dalrymple's written that. He's speculated there's 50 million people living in Antarctica.
Dalrymple has had a shocker here.
Yeah, he's lost the plot. And he's cranked things up to 11, though, basically. He's suggested that whichever European power gets there first and befriends the 50 million people hanging out there would have won the geopolitical lottery, essentially. Yeah. And so, writing that, 1769, Dalrymple sort of lights the spark, or fans the flames at least, of King George, Captain Cook, and Cook on his second voyage, setting out to do what he couldn't on his first and find that land of myth.
Yeah.
Winning glory for king and country.
There's probably 50 million penguins.
Probably. Well, for a little while at least.
Not as useful for trade.
Because, man, did they murder those penguins.
Right, true. Yeah.
So, anyway, inevitably, we find ourselves back with Captain Cook. And he's after that land that Dalrymple assured everybody was there. And they only need to go that little bit further. But Australian historian David Day, he wrote a book called Antarctica, a biography.
Yes.
He writes, Captain James Cook had the look of a disappointed man as he carried his charts and journal up the steps of the Admiralty building in London in August 1775. So basically, he didn't do what he was supposed to do.
What, didn't go there?
No, well, he tried. He went there, but he just didn't go there. Yeah. He didn't go all the way. But they weren't absolute failures, Cook's trip. His ships, HMS Resolution and Adventure, they crossed the Antarctic Circle 3 times over the 12 months between January of 73 and 74.
I mean, the ocean's pretty rough down there.
Yeah, and it's big.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot to see and a lot to stop you from seeing things.
Leopard seals.
Yeah, they're around. So, on both of his voyages in Antarctic waters, Cook got really close. He was probably within about a day's trip, sailing time of the coastline, but he had to go back. There was too much ice. So he was sort of beaten back by that. He wrote in his journal that he believed the existence of the polar continent down there to be probable. And
Way to sit on the fence.
he said, he said that he firmly believed it,
Oh, yeah.
and that he also thought that they'd probably seen it, but he just couldn't be sure. But no one had ever been that far south. So 71 degrees, 10 minutes south. That's pretty impressive. Another feather in his cap full of feathers. But he and his men believed the danger was just too great. They could not push it and go any further.
Yeah.
One of his men, a German geographer named George Forster, wrote that it was impossible to proceed farther, and no navigator will care to come after, and much less attempt to pass beyond us.
Mm-hmm.
I just did sort of vaguely menacing.
Yeah.
Just to be mean to Germany. And Cook's journal elaborates, stating that any explorer who could possibly go further than them would have to confront the unexpressible horrid aspect of a country doomed by nature, never once to feel the warmth of the sun rays, but to lie ever buried under everlasting snow and ice. And, you know, you've spoken about the two heroes of this, well, hero and villain perhaps,
maybe,
of this story. And they talk now, you know, in 1775, of it just being horrible down there. And even if someone wanted to go, there was nothing to see. It was just worthless.
Yeah.
Not worth the risk. So Cook, obviously we know he died in Hawaii.
Yeah.
His death sort of cemented him as an exemplar of modernity, I suppose, in this age of enlightenment. And while he was super negative about the place, if there's a people who aren't going to be put off by descriptions of it being freezing cold and dark all the time, it's probably the Russians.
Oh, yeah.
They love a bit of snow.
As soon as they heard it was freezing cold and nothing to see, they were like, get us down there.
Yeah, they're like, what, real estate is that cheap?
We'll build a city down there.
Yeah, and the Russians also love beating Napoleon.
Yes.
So Tsar Alexander was probably riding the crest of that wave. He ordered 2 expeditions to follow in Cook's wake. So 27th of January, 1820, a guy called Gottlieb von Bellinghausen and his crew, they became the second expedition
Yes.
to cross into the Antarctic Circle. He didn't get that credit for ages, but, modern historians give it to him. So that's, 1820. So in terms of our story, of humanity's understanding and experience of Antarctica and what that means, well, we've finally seen it.
Yeah.
So it only took about 300,000 years for humans to actually wander around everywhere.
Yeah.
So pretty good going. But after that first sighting in 1820, it just sort of snowballed from there. There was an American schooner, the Celia. They were possibly the first to set foot on Antarctica.
Huge.
So we're talking about the journey to the pole.
Surely there'd be a USA flag if they made it.
Yeah, probably.
Stuck in there.
Yeah, they love it. Bald eagles let loose, flying around.
Yeah.
They probably made it in 1821. Some people dispute it. The first absolutely confirmed first step on that journey to the South Pole was in 1895. And I haven't really spoken about all the commercial activity going on down there because it's one of those moments where what seemed impossible to get that far south is now just run of the mill.
Yeah, just jump on a plane.
Well, every man and his dog's down there. They're just going around like beating the shit out of every penguin and seal that they can find. So
that's nice.
Yeah, it's a pretty lucrative market back in Europe. So they've just clubbed. Some people reckon, over 1 million seals to death in the space of a pretty short space of time. And no one really knows how far south those commercial boats ventured because they were all in competition, so they didn't tell anyone. Super secret killing work. And a lot of stuff happened between the 1820s and the end of the century. A French guy did a bunch of stuff, and Ross, he would go down there.
I was wondering why it was called Ross Island.
Yeah. There's
Ross from Friends. Pivot.
Yeah. Rest in peace, Chandler. Ross named a bunch of stuff after himself. He went around. And the British also did some things, but the most notable thing about their things was that their things were steam-powered.
Oh, yeah.
So we've now got the advent of steam. You don't have to rely on sail.
Mm-hmm.
Now you can just chuck a bit of coal in the burner and push on through. And that's awesome because a guy who I'll talk about a lot later, who recognized the power of steam but applied his crazy genius brain to create a pretty unique vessel, he plays a central role in our story, and steam is a big part of that. And he's an absolute unit of a human too. So some of his accomplishments include helping to establish the field of neurology.
Yes.
Being the first person to ski across Greenland.
Yes.
Played a key role in Norway gaining its independence.
Yes.
And top it all off, wins the Nobel Peace Prize for just helping out the disenfranchised and dislocated peoples of World War One.
And you said he was a eunuch.
Unit.
Oh, unit.
Unit, yeah.
Okay,
I think he was intact.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
It'd be hard otherwise.
Some people just kind of grab the world by the scruff of the neck.
Yeah.
And Nansen, and we'll talk about later, is one of those people. So that's kind of it. That's the story of Antarctic exploration. We go from the Greeks through to Magellan and Drake and British and, there's one guy who wrote a lot about it called Roland Huntford. He wrote a book called The Last Place on Earth. And he ends his chapter on the topic of polar exploration with a discussion of 2 ships, the Erebus and the Terror.
Yes.
And Franklin, who was in command of those ships, British guy, didn't survive. Him and all 128 of his men died. Huntford wrote that they all perished of starvation and exposure and disease, and that it was just awful. But around them, the native people, the Eskimos, were just living pretty cruisy life.
They were like, why are you guys struggling so much?
Yeah, what's going on?
It's great out here.
Yeah, eat some of this.
Yeah.
And the British were like, no thanks, that looks gross. So Huntford basically just lays that out as being the climate at this point of polar exploration, that the British had kind of pushed, at least in the north, pretty far, done some things, but, they just didn't have the knowledge, the skill, But there are also hints that kind of knowledge and skill was available if only somebody could perhaps take advantage of it. And thus the scene is set, I suppose, for our discussion of our two
lads.
Our two blokes, yeah.
Yeah, nice. So, pretty interesting time, eh? The romantic idea of, I guess, British exploration. It was alive and well. And polar exploration was the big thing. Yeah, the North Pole hadn't been reached. South Pole hadn't been reached in 1900. And the scene was set for someone to come in and just achieve that. Enter Scott and Amundsen.
Woohoo!
So you're going to focus on Amundsen because he was kind of like knowledgeable, he was meticulously planned, he was thorough, and he was successful. And that's kind of the way that you approach this podcast.
Yeah.
So it makes sense for you to cover him.
I'm also a bit Norwegian.
Yeah, true. You look Norwegian.
Yeah.
Scott, on the other hand, was like grumpy, arrogant. He thought he knew it all, and he did little planning. And that kind of sums up how I approach this podcast.
What?
And most of the things he did ends in tragedy, much like my segments. So that's why I'll be covering him.
Great chat.
What's really sad about this story that I'm very disappointed in is that there's a general lack of hogs.
Yeah, I know. Well, I thought maybe when I mentioned the seals or penguins, we could just chuck a hog sound in there.
Because, I mean, Scott, it's probably part of Scott's downfall. He didn't really know how to travel in a polar environment. He tried ponies, he tried motorised sledges, he tried dogs, he even tried just men walking. Yeah. Never gave hogs a crack.
Was he perhaps pig-headed?
I like what you've done there. But imagine getting like 12 squealers all harnessed up on a sled. Or even a hogs and dogs combo.
That would be fantastic.
I'm pretty sure there's a Norwegian word for that.
Yeah.
Huggendas.
It's like surf
hogs and dogs. Hogs and dogs. So it's a real shame that we can't get the sound effect back, but we'll try and jam it in whenever. But imagine that though, like
5 opportunities.
You know, a pig falls over and collapses in the snow.
Yeah.
Bacon buddies for everyone.
Yeah, not even really a problem.
Win-win.
You'd be killing some of them on purpose.
Anyway, let's talk about Scott's early life because that's a good place to start.
Yeah. Not ancient Greece?
No, let's not go back that far. Scott was born in 1868 and he was the third of 6 children and the son of John Edward. Have a guess at what John Edward's job was.
Programmer.
Close. He was a brewer.
Okay.
What a gig.
Getting on the sauce.
Yeah. But there was also lots of naval military traditions in the family. Scott's grandfather and 4 of his uncles had all served in the army and the navy, so that was kind of a natural place to go. But they were relatively rich because John Scott's prosperity came from owning a small Plymouth brewery. And obviously everyone loved to get on it. Everyone loved to get steamed, as you were talking about before.
Yeah. Back to Plymouth.
So they were making a wee bit of money. Scott began his naval career in 1881 when he was 13 years old.
Oh, late starter compared to Blythe.
Truant from school, he would have been marked as.
That's not good.
Yeah. And he kind of progressed in the Navy relatively smoothly. He kind of worked his way slowly up the ranks. There was a small blot that occurred in 1893 when he was in charge of a torpedo boat and it ran aground.
Wait, a torpedo boat? What do you mean is that?
A boat with torpedoes.
Actually?
Yeah.
What date are we talking about?
1893.
Righto, there we go.
So, torpedoes?
Yeah.
I haven't verified that fact.
No, you heard it here first.
And he got a bit of a mild rebuke for that, but no biggie. And then later on, he was kind of stationed all around the world. At that stage, the British Empire was thriving. You know, they had India and the West Indies and all these other places. So
sun never sets.
He was stationed in the West Indies at one stage, and it's here that he had his first encounter with this guy called Clements Markham, who was the secretary of the Royal Geographical Society, and that would be a big moment for him because he would loom large in Scott's career in polar exploration.
Okay.
In 1894, he was a lieutenant torpedo officer, torpedoes again, on the depot ship, the HMS Falcon. And this is where he learned that a bit of financial calamity had overtaken his family. His dad had sold the brewery and somehow invested the proceeds unwisely. He probably put it on Manchester United to win the Derby or something.
No need for that.
Basically lost all the money and the family was now bankrupt. Okay, so Hannah Scott, his mum, 2 unmarried daughters, they now relied entirely on the money that Scott and the salary of his younger brother Archie were making.
Oh, yeah, better idea.
In the military. But then Archie died in 1898 after contracting typhoid fever.
Okay.
Now all the financial responsibility of the whole family was on Robert Falcon Scott.
Sweet name.
So in some ways, there was like a bit of money pressure there.
Yeah.
So that might have.
Oh, welcome to the world, mate.
Yeah, yeah. But going back to his name,
Yeah.
Falcon.
Yeah, that's cool.
Great call.
Yeah.
Great call from the parents.
Yeah.
It's strong, isn't it?
Yeah.
And anyway, in 1899, he had this encounter with Clements Markham, and he learned that there was going to be an Antarctic expedition, because that's what Markham was all about. And he was very keen to lead that, so he volunteered himself.
Mm-hmm.
You might wonder, how did he just get in there straight away? Why Scott? It's like, at that time, polar expeditions weren't that popular.
Yeah.
Because as an officer in the Navy, there was so much stuff going on. I mean, like Germany was starting to build its fleet up.
Mm-hmm.
The origins of World War I were happening. So the officers were kind of like, okay, we need to be around, get promoted to get our chance to lead these battleships, etc. if we go to war.
Yeah.
So there wasn't all these big names applying for this kind of polar exploration.
Yeah, you don't just want to sail off and die on the eve of being a national hero, maybe.
Yeah. But the other thing that helped Scott is that Clements believed in youth.
Mm.
And what I mean by that is he liked to hang around with young guys.
Oh, yeah?
I don't know.
Don't we all?
I don't know what that means. I didn't investigate that anymore.
Okay.
I'm just going to leave that floating in the air.
Yeah.
But he was looking for a protege that he could live vicariously. Because he used to be a bit of an explorer. He's now pretty old.
Yeah.
But he was quite
He's
keen.
exploring other things.
He was quite keen to send people out and live through them.
Yeah.
And he was very impressed by Scott's intelligence, his enthusiasm, and his charm,
His physique?
among other things.
Okay, yeah.
It says in this book that Scott was attractive when he chose to be. It also said he knew how to play up for the older people.
Okay.
And Clements soon saw favour in his eyes.
This
So
is good stuff. I had no idea that the story was.
I'm just going to leave that there.
Okay.
So somehow Scott has kind of managed to get through the eye of the needle. He's come from like being a low lieutenant, and somehow he's weaseled his way onto being considered to lead an Antarctic expedition.
Yeah.
Mainly because of like, it's all about who you know, not what you know, eh?
Yeah.
So
Do you think he chose to be attractive when he was around Markham?
Yeah, he did. He knew what he was doing.
Yep.
I mean, it helped that the best officers didn't want to go to Antarctica, and then the Boer War breaks out, and obviously British is recruiting all the army guys, all the navy guys. We need you for this.
Yeah.
So very little demand, and he took his chance. So he got promoted to lead the Antarctic expedition. The interesting thing is, he got promoted to lead it, and yet Scott was a little bit ignorant, and he was ignorant of polar travel. He hadn't done anything. He hadn't had any experience, and he hadn't done any research. And one of the interesting things is he didn't really bother to do too much research for that.
Well, I mean, he's British though.
Yeah.
You know, so.
Yeah. So
he can just do it all.
And the same with Clements Markham. He was like an old school explorer, and he was kind of like relying on old school methods, even though the kind of technology was changing.
Yeah.
You know, he's just one of those old school guys who are like, we'll do it the old way.
Bit of hard yakka.
And so Clements Markham got a boat built, right? But he didn't know what the needs of a polar ship were. He's just like, we'll just do it the old Navy way, just build me a boat.
Just like we did to go to the West Indies.
Yeah.
How different could it be?
So no idea about like travelling in ice and all the things, that strengthening and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing about Clements Markham is he was all about British exploration, suffering. If you suffer, that is achievement. You can't make it too easy. And therefore, he wasn't interested in using dogs to get across the snow.
Yeah, right.
He loved the idea of man-hauling.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing compares to a blue jacket plodding through the snow, was his quote. He was also against skis. Get some solid British men hauling sleds, and that's the way it should be done. So that's kind of Scott's mentor, and that's who he's learning from. So unfortunately, he was going to have a massive kind of influence on Scott and the way he travelled when he went to the Antarctic region. What's interesting is Scott didn't go and visit a kind of polar legend in Amundsen. You already mentioned him.
Yeah.
He did go and meet with him because he was like, well, this guy's been all around Greenland. He's been in the Arctic. He knows how to make things happen. Amundsen was not that impressed because Scott turned up with a kind of like solid attitude of, I know what I'm doing. I'll come and talk to you, but I've got my way of doing this. And Amundsen's like, you've got to use skis and you've got to use dogs. You know, this is how you travel in snow. But he couldn't really like sell Scott on that.
Yeah, okay.
It's like he had his mind made up.
Yeah.
And I think he also had this kind of attitude that many people in the Navy did back then. It was like, there's nothing the Navy can't do. That was their motto. We'll figure it out. We'll get it done. It's all about improvisation and kind of we'll get down there and just make it work.
And if we have to suffer, then great.
Yeah.
That's a bonus.
Yeah. So instead of learning how to ski, as Nansen was like telling Scott, he spent all his time just organising the paperwork, the logistics, which is fair. I mean, there is a lot of that stuff going.
Yeah.
But he put no effort to actually learn the skills that might be needed to get across the polar ice shelf.
Yeah.
Which is crazy. Another silly thing that just seems weird is he took a bunch of dogs, but he didn't hire anyone that knew how to use dogs, that knew how to use them with sleds.
Yeah.
No one was a dog driver. Everyone was kind of new to it. He just, again, assumed we'll figure it out once we get down there.
He just took them to play fetch.
So this is
companionship.
this is the kind of planning that was going on for the Discovery expedition. This is in 1901. This is when this is all happening. So the first big polar expedition, Antarctic expedition for the British, led by Scott. And there was another big name on the trip. You might have heard of him, a guy called Ernest Shackleton.
Yeah, I know that guy.
He was on there as well. So he got called in. And it was a pretty big deal for Britain. They just had a new king. Edward VII had just come onto the throne. And he was pretty into this whole British exploration thing. So he came on board on the ship, the Discovery, just before it launched. And he kind of blessed their expedition.
Score.
Wished them all the best.
Oh, they won't need dogs. That'll be fine.
Yeah.
King's blessing.
Yeah. Away they go.
USA.
So it kind of feels like first polar expedition, a fair bit of money's been sunk into this, but the planning is pretty light. And it's light because the British attitude is a bit of like, we know best.
Yeah.
We'll figure it out. Rather than going and actually learning from, because at that stage, people had been in the Arctic. And people had done some big trips up there, like Nansen. These guys had some skills and some tips and some advice that they were quite happy to pass on, but the British weren't that interested. They wanted to go and do their own thing.
Yeah. So
off they go. And it says that the voyage to New Zealand was not that happy.
Oh, no.
Numerous people have said that Scott was pretty impatient. He was easily flustered. And the Discovery boat itself was very sluggish. It didn't have any kind of sea trials. The engines were real inefficient. And the trip took 6 weeks longer than it was meant to, which no doubt fired Scott up tremendously. They decided to skip their stop in Melbourne, which is fair enough.
Yeah.
No one wants to go there anyway.
No.
So it gets to Lyttelton, Christchurch, and they spend 3 weeks getting it repaired because fixing all the holes and things like that.
Yeah. Did they make any other modifications to it, or were they just fixing what was broken on this already?
Yeah, just repairing any kind of leaks and fixing it up. Anyway, they carry on. From Christchurch, they head on down, and in 1902, Scott sees Antarctica. It's pretty exciting.
Yeah.
Because at that time he was one of the first people to see it, like you said before.
Well, if you take the 1895 date as being the one when people first stepped on it, he's not far off that.
Yeah, he's only 7 years later.
Yeah.
And he obviously names it King Edward VII Land, original.
Real catchy.
And that part had never been seen by humans before. And then they popped into McMurdo Sound because that seemed like so if you know Antarctica, McMurdo Sound is a really sheltered little bay. So they popped in there in their boat, the Discovery, and they decided to winter there.
Which no one had done.
No one had done. No one had stayed down there. And they, what they did is they whipped up a hut.
Cool.
Yeah, it's pretty cool, eh? Get this.
What, they chopped trees down, or?
No. So it was like a kit set hut, and it was designed in Australia.
Oh, yeah.
But
the Aussies know.
Just remember, Australia's got a different climate to Antarctica, so they said that the hut wasn't necessarily perfectly designed for like Antarctic environment.
Yeah. But
get this, the hut's still there.
Cool.
You can go visit it.
Yeah, that's awesome.
It's right by McMurdo Station, Scott Base. So if you ever go down to Scott Base with the New Zealand crew or the American crew at McMurdo Station, the old hut's just we walk away.
That's not bad for a little prefab.
Yeah.
Built by Aussies.
How good. How good. But another interesting point is that like heaps of money was spent on equipment. Like Markham was amazing at raising money for this trip, and they got some pretty cool equipment. But they didn't spend any money on learning how to use it.
Yeah.
So
you'll figure it out later.
all this stuff that was down there that no one had done any training in. And they were just like, we'll improvise.
Yeah.
We're the British. We'll work it out.
And they'd left behind all of the things that people who did have experience told them to take.
Yeah. And once they got down there, Scott was still very much anti-skis.
Mm-hmm.
He was not interested in skis. He hadn't learned how to ski, even though Nansen, the one guy that had like credibility in this kind of area, told him to use it.
It was his non-negotiable.
What do you know? I'm British. They got the dogs out. They had a crack with the dogs. They harnessed them up, but they couldn't get them to work. They couldn't get them to pull the sleds because, again, they'd done no training.
Yeah.
And this
they were looking for the on button.
This fired Scott up, no doubt. So they weren't off to a good start. The dogs weren't working, and most people were giving up on the skis because they hadn't bothered to learn how to do it before they arrived, and they were finding it pretty tough down in Antarctica. Scott was running a pretty tight ship, excuse the pun. He was running it as a hierarchy with classic Navy rules. So there was the officers, and then there's the other men, and never shall they hang out together or eat dinner together. So there was a fair bit of tension going. But what's interesting is that it became pretty clear that Shackleton, who had a lot more charisma, kind of became the moral leader. He was well respected by the men. They all liked him a lot better.
He's definitely a Pacific legend.
Yeah, he's a Pacific legend. Yeah. And Scott it didn't come naturally to him. It's kind of like a Bligh Scott kind of thing going on. Yeah. Bad leadership, bad people skills.
Yeah.
And Scott became pretty jealous of Shackleton because of this. So that's not ideal, is it?
No, and we've seen that kind of, like you said, situation play out before. Here we have Shackleton as Fletcher Christian.
Yeah. So once they were down there, they kind of started to get established, and they decided that they wanted to go for a bit of a expedition to see how far they could get. Mm-hmm. Maybe they might even make the South Pole, right?
Yeah, cool.
So they're going to undertake this march, and the three people chosen to undertake the march would be Scott, obviously, Shackleton, and a scientist called Edward Wilson.
Boring.
So those three took off, and what's interesting is if you shorten Robert Scott's name, what do you get?
Rob.
No, not that short.
Oh.
Shorten the other half.
Rob.
Bert.
And
if you shorten Ernest Shackleton's name, what do you get?
Oh, we've got Ernie and Bert.
So this may just be the first example of Bert and Ernie. Hey, Bert.
Yeah.
Hey, Ernie.
So that was kind of the dynamic between Bert and Ernie.
What do you want to do today, Bert? Walk to the South Pole.
Hit you in the head repeatedly.
Yeah, so maybe that's what those two characters are based on. I'm not going to verify that fact. I'm just going to throw it out there.
We didn't have time for that.
Bert and Ernie. So anyway, off they go. These three lads. Scurvy broke out.
Oh no.
This is why they should have had the hogs.
Yeah.
No fresh food.
Yeah.
No vitamin C. Suddenly the lads have got scurvy. Not great. So there's a fair bit of tension going on. And then Shackleton burns a hole in the tent.
Okay.
With the gas cooker.
Right. As a prank?
No. Oh. Just an accident.
Yeah, okay.
Scott was furious.
Yeah, he would be.
And they were butting heads hard.
Yeah.
Those two men, Scott and Shackleton, were incompatible together.
Someone's taken Scott's coconut.
Just two massive egos. Luckily, Wilson was there because those two could not get on.
Yeah. And
Wilson kind of was forced to patch it up because basically the expedition was falling apart already.
Yeah.
So they managed to get all the way to the 82nd parallel. Further than anyone had got before by miles. Was pretty good achievement. They were coming to the 82nd parallel, and Scott said to Shackleton, "You stay here. Me and Wilson are going to go to this parallel and get this amazing achievement." And he didn't let him come on. And that's something that Shackleton never forgot.
Why did he tell him to stay there?
Ego.
That's just
pride.
Okay.
That's his big rivalry.
Stay here, young pup.
Yeah.
Let the big dogs take it over.
So on this journey, there was already examples of kind of Scott's, I guess, laserdaxical attitude when it comes to like travel. Because they put in these like depots, right? So you're skiing towards the South Pole, and along the way you drop food in a depot. So when you come back, you can find the food, and you don't have to carry it the whole way.
Yeah.
But they would mark it. Scott would be marking it with a single flag because when they put the depot in, the weather was beautiful. And Scott kind of had this idea that the weather's beautiful now. It'll be beautiful when we come back. I'll just put one flag in and we'll be able to find it, no worries.
Yeah.
So he was really lucky on this trip that the weather played ball and they were able to find those depots. But if there was any kind of blizzard or any poor visibility, they could have easily missed these depots. And these guys were cutting it pretty fine with their food, could have led to starvation. And that's kind of a bit of foreshadowing.
Yeah, if there's one thing more powerful than Mother Nature, though, it's like the British Empire and their divine right to just be the best. And
Yeah, well, I guess we'll figure that out as we go. Very chilled attitude.
Yeah. Good pun.
They get tired of hauling dog food. What do you think they do?
Ride the dogs to exhaustion.
And then kill them.
Yeah.
So we can't be bothered carrying the dog food. Let's get rid of the dogs. So the whole thing was pretty bad, haphazard planning, and they almost died. This is the thing. Shackleton collapsed on the way back.
Yeah.
Of exhaustion. I mean, he had scurvy. They both had scurvy.
Scurvy wrecks you. Like it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And you got to remember, they were all anti-skis. So rather than like traveling on top of the snow, they were plodding along. It's what's called post-holing, when your feet go through the snow, and it's exhausting.
Yeah.
Like every foot is like walking in quicksand. So luckily, when Shackleton collapsed, he had left his skis in the depot, and they managed to get his skis back. And because he was able to put his skis on, that essentially saved him. It saved him a lot of energy. He was able to travel a lot faster.
At that point, then, did they look at skis and go, hang on?
No.
No.
That's the interesting thing.
Right.
They were really lucky to find the next depot, because after they'd found it, a big blizzard hit. But luckily they got in before that, and they managed to essentially get back to McMurdo base, where their hut was.
By the skin of their
So
teeth.
they were very fortunate. Roland Huntford, in his book that you mentioned, he says it was a dress rehearsal for disaster.
Oh, yeah.
Essentially,
Wow.
I mean, he did a lot of silly things, Scott, on this trip. But the ironic thing is, there wasn't a whole lot of learning that happened either.
Yeah, okay.
So Scott gets back from this trip. He's kind of, he's achieved something. He's gotten to the 82nd parallel, but it hasn't really improved his mood, because he wanted to go further, right? He wanted to bag the South Pole.
Yeah.
So he's a bit annoyed, and he decides, I'm going to send all the merchant seamen home. And what I mean by that is, half of the expedition were Navy folk, and half were like merchant seamen.
Half were good people.
And they didn't really get on that well.
Yeah.
So he's like, flag these merchant guys. They can go. They can get out of here. We're going to stay here, do some more polar stuff, and you guys can get out.
Shackleton must have been merchant?
Well, Shackleton also got sent home. Yep.
Okay.
And he got sent home because Scott in some way was blaming him that they didn't go any further than the 82nd parallel.
Yeah. He selfishly got scurvy.
Yeah.
Couldn't
Yeah. So he was like a bit of a scapegoat in some ways.
Okay.
And there was like, all that butting heads. Shackleton's behaviour, Scott kind of looked at it as almost mutinous.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing more than we love than a mutiny.
Boom, boom, boom.
But just Scott was not happy with him. He said he's got to go.
Yeah.
So sent him home. Shackleton was filthy about that. He wanted to stay.
Yeah.
There was more stuff he wanted to do. He didn't want to miss out on any of the kind of things they had planned. There was still a whole lot of scientific stuff. Scott said, you got to go. But what's funny is Shackleton leaves and the crew kind of cheers him off. Not in a see you later, sucker way, but in a you're awesome, we respect you.
Yeah.
So that no doubt fires Scott up even more. The person that was in charge of the merchant seamen was Armitage. He was second in charge on the whole expedition.
Mm-hmm.
Scott tried to send him home as well, but he refused to go because, again, he knew that if he went, it would kind of be a bit of shame on his name for leaving the expedition early.
Yeah.
And luckily he had in his contract that he couldn't be dismissed by Scott, so he was able to stay.
It's crazy how much fragile ego seems to dictate this sort of thing.
Oh, yeah. So the rest of them and all the Navy lads, they stayed down there with Scott. They did some more man-hauling, and they got some more records. They went the furthest south. They went the furthest west.
Mm-hmm.
And they did a bunch of scientific experiments. Their boat, the Discovery, got stuck in ice. And
sounds like a problem.
So they couldn't really leave anyway.
Yeah.
So the Admiralty back in Britain, they obviously they knew of this. They knew that they were all stuck down there. So they sent 2 relief ships down. One of the ships was called the Terra Nova.
Yeah.
And you'll learn more about the ship later on.
Mm-hmm.
So you'd think, oh, that's cool. The Admiralty sending some ships down to look after him. That's a good thing, right?
Yeah.
No.
Oh.
Humiliating. Scott was gutted. It was like,
Scott was humiliated.
yeah,
Right.
this is embarrassing. I need to be rescued by the Admiralty kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's like that classic idea. I can look after myself.
Yeah.
So it was not great for Scott. But luckily, the Discovery, after 2 years being down there, McMurdo Station, the Discovery became free from the ice, and he was able to get it out and sail back to Littleton, Christchurch.
Cool.
But as he arrives in Littleton, he gets a message from the Admiralty saying, "We congratulate you on your safe return," which again doesn't seem that bad.
No, it's nice.
But Scott took it as being quite passive aggressive, like a little bit sarcastic. Well done, you've got out of the ice, kind of thing.
Good job for doing the bare minimum.
So
I really like Scott.
So allowing the Discovery to be frozen in and stuck in the ice, it was a bit of a black mark. Wasn't great. Luckily, his mate Sir Clements, who had been knighted, he put in a good word with the king. That's always handy, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the king published sent a message saying, "Well done, Scott, you did all this great stuff down here." Clements got that published in the press, and Scott's reputation was restored. So it's like, good save.
Yeah.
So he managed to come back a couple of years down in Antarctica, arrived back in Britain, got himself a promotion all the way up to captain, just like Bligh.
Yep.
Captain Scott. He's back from Antarctica, but it's a bit of a problem for the Admiralty because now you've got this guy who's been promoted to captain, which is pretty high up.
Yeah.
But he's got no experience in leading a battleship or any kind of these big navy boats that a captain is meant to be doing. And the Admiralty's like, well, what do we do? His rank said that he should be in charge of these big boats, but
he refuses to learn anything.
He's got no idea, and we don't really love his attitude.
Yeah.
Luckily, Scott decided that he would go away and write a book. And the Admiralty was like, great, have 6 months leave, write your book, then we don't have to deal with you. So off he went, and he did that. He wrote The Voyage of the Discovery. In this time, he also married Kathleen Bruce in 1908.
Scott was probably fairly complimentary of himself in his book, was he?
Yeah, well, let me tell you about that because it was a pretty popular book.
Yeah, bestseller.
And Scott may be pretty rubbish at planning missions and executing them, but he was a good writer.
Okay.
And he kind of turned all his faults into virtues. And any kind of stuff that happened on the trip, not using dogs, not using skis, he kind of made it sound like it was the honourable thing to do because we're British people plodding through the snow. And the book kind of made him sound like he was the most amazing leader ever.
My biggest faults are I care too much.
Yeah, basically.
I'm a perfectionist.
Basically.
Yeah.
That's what it said. And unfortunately, the reason, in the book, the reason they only got to the 82nd parallel and had to turn around was old Ernie. Shackleton held them back. So he was used as a bit of a scapegoat. It wasn't Scott's fault.
No.
It was this other guy.
Ernest
He was terrible. So again, fueled the rivalry even more.
Yeah.
One thing that's important at the time is that it's all about the adventure, but it's all about how you get the word out to the public. It's all about how the public perceives you is almost more important than what you actually did.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're going to talk about the North Pole, but there was two guys later on that claimed to find the North Pole, Cook and Peary.
Yeah.
And there was a massive argument as to who got there first. It was all about who got the headline in the paper first. How you were perceived was really, really important. And the thing going for Scott is he knew how to write and he knew how to make himself sound really good.
And he had Markham in the King's ear.
Yeah, and he had friends in high places. That was pretty fortunate. He also left out the fact that on their trip they all got scurvy. He didn't mention that in this book.
No
need to mention that.
You don't want to bring the people down with those sorts of details.
Yeah. He wrote, to talk about the failure of not using dogs or skis, he said that in the Antarctica region, nothing is to equal the honest use of one's own legs. How good.
Nothing is equally stupid than using...
It's way more noble.
Yeah.
So there's this heroic delusion that man-hauling is the most morally desirable way to travel. And that eventually is going to cause him some issues.
Yeah.
So Roland Huntford said, Amundsen was very faithful to his diaries. Whenever he wrote anything, he was kind of like, I'm just going to write exactly out of my diary. I'm just going to tell people how it is. Scott was a romantic, and he was perhaps a little bit delusional in the reality of what happened when he wrote his books.
Yeah.
How can I make this sound amazing?
Yeah.
How can I sell it?
But there's something to that too, in knowing that public perception matters, and intentionally manipulating that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So basically, Scott comes out and he's a bit of a hero. His books are like a bestseller, and because he's made himself sound so amazing, the public love him.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Shackleton, he's been kind of like damaged by this book. So he's like, right, the only way for me to get back and, restore myself, I'm not going to write a book. I'm just going to go do my own Antarctic expedition.
Yeah.
So he goes on and he announces his plans to travel back down there.
Mm-hmm.
Scott, he's furious about this.
Yeah.
So Scott was really hurt by the news of Shackleton wanting to go to Antarctica. And he says, this is his quote, "I believe that every explorer looks at certain regions as his own. No one else has, without his consent, any right to use it." So basically what he's saying is, Antarctica's mine. That's my area to explore. How dare you plan on going down there without asking me first?
Don't touch my stuff.
So you can just kind of see the ego that's going on for Scott there. Shackleton wants to go down and do his own thing. And Scott's like, nah, this is totally unfair. You shouldn't be allowed to do that. And he says to Shackleton, well, you can't use the hut. You can't go to McMurdo Station, like McMurdo Sound.
They can't even go into the Sound.
That's my area.
Oh, yeah.
You've got to go somewhere else. So eventually Shackleton agrees. He says, okay, I won't go there. I'll go somewhere else. Just because Scott was
So he was the bigger man.
Getting lawyers involved. Well, he tried to resist, but it was causing way too much fuss. So in the end, he said, "Yeah, look, I'm not going to do it."
Right.
This caused even more resentment between the two.
Yeah.
So off Shackleton went on a boat called the Nimrod.
It's a nifty little name compared to all the other like cool sort of Latin-y or adventurous ones.
Yeah.
Nimrod.
Yeah. This is 1906. We're talking now. Scott's like, well, we've got unfinished business down there. The South Pole's still there. No one's done it. He was really worried about Shackleton getting there. So he starts to organise a second expedition. We need to make this. We need to get down there and sort this out before someone else does and takes my glory.
Yeah.
So in 1907, they start to find the money for the expedition. And this time we're going to have a fair crack at the South Pole. The first one was kind of like, we'll see if we can get to the South Pole, but we'll just do a bunch of other stuff if we don't. This time it's like the South Pole is our goal.
And we're going to do the same things that didn't work last time.
Yeah.
Give us money.
Basically. Somehow they managed to raise a lot of money. Scott learned from the discovery that man hauling wasn't the best option.
Maybe suffering isn't always great.
But he still wasn't that into dogs.
Right.
He's like, okay, you're right. Maybe I'll use skis some of the time.
Mm-hmm.
But I ain't using dogs. They suck. And then what he decided to do is like, why don't we embrace technology and why don't we design a motor sledge?
Yeah.
As in a little petrol-powered kind of motorized thing that I can drive across the Antarctica to the
Snowmobile.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, at this stage, the petrol engine was still in its infancy, right? So it wasn't a common thing. And these guys were like, okay, why don't we just make one, take it down to the most inhospitable place in the world and see if it works?
Does it work? Probably.
So they started designing these motor sledges, and Scott told them to not waste time testing in freezing chambers because there were cars working in Canada in winter.
Oh, yeah.
So therefore, this will work in Antarctica.
Yeah, well, Shackleton's on his way, so quick.
Yeah. We need to sort this out real quick.
Yeah.
So his wife, Kathleen Bruce, she's an interesting lady. During this time in between the missions, they have some kids, but you kind of get the feeling that Kathleen is pretty keen for Scott to go away on an expedition.
Well, yeah. I
She's
mean,
not like,
I wouldn't want to hang out with
please
that guy.
don't go away on that 2 or 3 year expedition.
Yeah.
It's more like, when are you leaving?
Yeah, I hope you don't die.
Yeah, all the best. So that seems like an interesting relationship.
Yeah.
And back to Shackleton. So he's now in the Antarctic.
So he gets there first.
He's down there. Yep, he's left. I mean, Scott's still doing all the planning and he's down there.
Some of the planning.
And he ends up using McMurdo Sound. But to be honest, he tries to go other places.
Classic Ernie.
He goes to like 3 other places and tries to tries to set up there, but they're like not good locations. He can't do it.
You wonder how hard he actually tried.
So he ends up at McMurdo.
Yeah, well, I guess
And
I'll go
Shackleton
here.
says, my conscience is clear. I tried
Mhm.
to go elsewhere, but I couldn't. But Scott was furious,
Yeah.
obviously.
Typically.
That's what was going on.
Threatened to shoot them in the face.
And off Shackleton went. And he got within 97 miles of the pole. It was a new record. He blew the 82nd parallel out of the water. So basically Shackleton, real famous expedition, went all the way across Antarctica and decided to turn around. People talk about this as like this amazing, courageous decision because he could have easily carried on,
Yeah.
but it probably would have meant that a bunch of them would have died.
He could have been pig-headed.
Yeah, he could have. And this is kind of the difference between Scott and Shackleton. When he got back, his wife asked, why did you turn around? You're so close.
Coward.
And his famous quote is, I thought you would rather have a live donkey than a dead lion.
Oh, yeah.
Very famous quote from Shackleton.
She said, wrong.
So no one died on that expedition. He saved everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And got very, very close to the pole.
Yeah. Sounds like a lion to me.
But they also did a whole bunch of other stuff. They went to the South Magnetic Pole.
Mm-hmm.
They climbed Mount Erebus. When Shackleton came back, he was knighted because of this style of leadership. You know, he kept everyone safe.
Man,
No
his
one died.
fortunes have turned around.
He had a bunch of charisma,
Yeah.
and he was very popular compared to
Other people.
old Falcon.
Yeah, his
Old
wife
Falcon
doesn't even like
Scott.
him.
Okay, so that's where we're going to leave the first episode. Scott has been down to Antarctica. He's done a pretty significant mission on the Discovery.
Proven himself pretty intensely unlikable from my perspective.
Went down with his mate Shackleton. They had a massive falling out. He wrote a book about it, blamed Shackleton for all the bad things that happened, which most wasn't true.
Sorry to get him scurvy.
Shackleton got angry, decided to go to Antarctica himself, came very close to getting to the South Pole, but didn't quite make it, but came back a hero because he saved everyone.
Yeah.
And now Scott's fired up for his next expedition and bagging the pole.
Brilliant.
So that's kind of setting the scene for Scott. In the next episode, you'll be setting the scene for Amundsen,
Yep.
his early life, what he gets up to. And then it'll be all on.
Yeah, the race to the pole.
The Pacific Legends
Unleashed.